Alright, AP Human Geography classes, here's our second video on services, and we're going to focus on where are contemporary services located. You could probably guess, right, where these centers of services are located, either in rural or urban areas, but nonetheless, we're going to get to it. Alright, let's talk about rural versus urban settlement. Well, maybe self-explanatory, rural settlement obviously are centers for agriculture, and they provide a small number of services to a small amount of population, whereas urban settlements are centers for consumer and business services, and they provide a large amount of services for a large population. What is interesting, as of recent times, roughly a 50% split between people living in urban versus rural areas around the world, the first time ever. All right, let's talk about rural settlements, specifically clustered rural settlements. Now, these are places where a number of families live close together and where the fields are surrounded by houses and farmlands. There's kind of a common farm area. Now, people here are allocated a certain strip of their farmland, which is roughly about a mile or so. And these settlements are arranged into two types of patterns. One is a circular pattern, which is a centralized open space for cultivation in the middle, surrounded by housing and farming structures. And one example is the Kral villages of South Africa, which you see in the top right picture. Another pattern of rural settlement, linear rural, and this is when farmland extends behind a house literally almost in a straight line, which is along a road or river or some sort of area to facilitate communication. An example of this is the French long lot system, which is in the picture to the right here, and it's found along the St. Lawrence River in Quebec. And you can see how the farmland extends in a straight line, if you will, towards the river right there. All right, now let's talk about a dispersed rural settlement. And this is typically found in North American landscape. This is categorized by farmers living on their individual farm in an isolated region from other farmers. There's not really a common ground to farm on. Now, this dominated the middle landscape during the colonial era because of so much land out there. Now, Great Britain also had something called the enclosure movements, and what they wanted to do was mimic this dispersed rural settlement. They had a lot of small individual strips of land that people were farming that didn't seem real efficient, and what they did was they converted these pieces of land into one large farmland for one person. What this did was it brought greater agricultural efficiency, but unfortunately it displaced many farmers, which pushed them into cities. Now these enclosure movements timed during the late 1700s, early 1800s with the Industrial Revolution that forced many farmers to cities, and this actually further overcrowded cities, even though it created a more agricultural efficient farmland area. All right, so we now know that there's a shifting of services, right, from rural areas to urban areas. And there's a gentleman by the name of Lewis Wirth in the 1930s. He's a social scientist that identified that there are differences between rural and urban dwellers for three different reasons. One reason is something called large size, and this is literally the population. In a rural area, chances are you know most of the inhabitants, or you might be related to some of them, and you see them in, let's say, local shops, at church, just, around the neighborhood. In urban areas, you only know probably a very small percentage of inhabitants, and you know them because of specific roles that they fill for you, such as they're the local cashier at your grocery store, or perhaps they're your lawyer, or perhaps even they're your boss. So you know people in different ways, in different roles. Second is high density, and what that means is the amount of jobs that are available. In a rural area, well, most people are farmers, and there's little specialization needed, and if there is, it's very small because of the population. In an urban area, there's a large number of people performing a variety of tasks, so there's lots of specialization. And what happens is, in urban areas, is that these social groups compete with one another for the same territory, which can lead to conflict, not always. Last but not least, there's something called social heterogeneity. So in rural areas, right, people have similar interests, they probably look like you, they act like you, they're not as diverse in rural areas. And if one does want to become diverse or pursue a different type of social life, you might become an outcast. Well, in an urban area, there is a greater variety of people with a varied amount of interests. And even if you want to diverge from the local social life, you will probably be accepted in a different type of group because acceptability is on such a larger scale in urban areas versus rural areas. Okay, so there's no secret. There has been an increase in percentage of people in cities, and this is due to urbanization. And we've talked about this. The process by which urban settlement grows, right? Cities grow. So why urbanization? Why did it happen? Well, Industrial Revolution, there it is, all right? More jobs were created, more technology was therefore advanced, and then more services were needed in those areas. Simple as that. Now, there are two ways to identify and score urbanization. It's the number of people living in cities, and as of right now, MDCs, 75% of people live in urban areas compared to the 40% LDCs. with the exception of Latin America, where it actually mimics more MDC than LDC regions. And the percentage of people living in cities in the 1800s, about 200 years ago, 3% of people lived in cities. 200 years later, right, in 2008, actually a little over 50%, 51% people live in cities now. There's a dramatic change over the last 200 years. And that's hence why we see a shift from rural to urban areas. Okay, that was it. We'll talk more about this in class. See you then.